he was braver than your usual rock star.
Was he a girl? Was he a boy? What was he thinking?
Nobody has ever broken the rules as he has.
David Bowie's unique talent made him an icon in the world of popular music. His fearless approach to everything from art and fashion to acting and sexual role-playing made him a rock and roll revolutionary. He battled social prejudice, personal tragedy, and even drug addiction.
I thought, who are you? What have you become?
But his key to survival was almost constant change.
He could reinvent himself every couple of years, but if he didn't make great records, people wouldn't be interested.
David's role has been monumental in expanding the concept of what a pop star or a rock star or an entertainer can be.
David Bowie began his wildly unconventional life in an ordinary working-class London neighborhood. For the conservative post-war residents of Brixton, playing by the rules was the key to success. But by rejecting conformity, David Bowie would ironically become Brixton's most famous native son.
Now Ziggy played guitar.
The creator of rock and roll spaceman Ziggy Stardust arrived on Earth on January the 8th, 1947. He started life as David Robert Jones, and though his given name was fairly run-of-the-mill, the household he grew up in was far from conventional. His parents, Hayward Jones and Peggy Burns, were unmarried. David was the couple's first child together, and each of them already had other children from previous relationships. In fact, it wasn't until David was 8 months old that Hayward and Peggy were wed. David's mother was an assertive, no-nonsense woman who worked part-time as a movie theater usherette. David's father once harbored his own show business aspirations. His first wife had been a singer, but his efforts to launch her career had failed. By the time David came along, Hayward Jones had become a public relations man for an orphanage.
His father was a small, quiet, quite studious man, very gentle, very sweet. I never heard him raise his voice. His mother, she was a little sterner.
I know he loved his father very much, and he was probably closer to his father than to his mother.
David also shared a strong bond with his half-brother Terry Burns.
Terry was a real big brother to David. He was a bright guy. They had a lovely symbiotic relationship. Terry was very much his best friend, and he loved him very much.
David idolized his brother. Terry was David's protector and often helped his shy little brother cope with a dark cloud that hung over the Jones family. A number of their mother's relatives suffered from schizophrenia. Some had been institutionalized. Others had committed suicide.
It's been fairly well recorded that my family is pretty rampantly, that's the word. I'm not so sure how much of it is madness. I think that there's an awful lot of emotional and spiritual mutilation goes on in my family.
The specter of mental illness haunted young David and was rarely discussed outside the Jones home. Although he didn't fully understand the ongoing problem, David felt it made him different from other children. In 1956, 9-year-old David lost daily contact with his brother when Terry enlisted in the Royal Air Force. A year later, the Jones family moved to the London suburb of Bromley, where David soon made new friends.
He was always a great thinker and a great worker out of things. And he was a neat, tidy little boy, the kind of boy that Mum likes you to bring home.
The well-behaved youngster quickly fit into the suburban setting and joined a local Boy Scout troop.
Soon after we'd enrolled, we started talking about music straight away.
David loved all things American, especially the country's latest export, rock and roll.
We were listening to the stuff that was out and that shocked our parents. Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, and Little Richard.
Ready, set, go, man, go!
Little Richard was different from every other performer on the music scene. His androgynous, almost effeminate looks and sexually suggestive lyrics made him more outlandish and more subversive than any of his contemporaries. Young David Jones found the combination both fascinating and inspiring.
I wanted to be a white Little Richard at 8, or at least his sax player.
David had already sort of prepared himself for fame, you know, even when I met him at 9, you know, he was kind of already going that direction.
In 1958, David began attending Bromley Technical School, where art was his favourite subject. Soon after, his brother Terry returned from military service. He shared with 11-year-old David his newfound love for the Beat Poets and Jack Kerouac's iconic tale of nonconformity, On the Road. He also gave David a taste of what life was like outside of middle-class Bromley.
Terry was the one who took him to London for the first time and played a role in introducing him to different forms of music.
Terry showed David London's bohemian Soho district, where they listened to jazz and rhythm and blues acts in nightclubs. Before long, David was making music of his own by taking up the guitar and the saxophone.
I wanted to be a musician because it seemed rebellious, it seemed subversive.
David also began experimenting with his look.
His appearance was always a little bit out of the way from the point of view of normal school dress. His hair was always light and cut short.
David was into fads. I mean, they might only last a few days or even hours.
Although David prided himself on being a maverick, he was just like many boys when it came to the opposite sex. A crush on a girl named Carol led to a brawl with his best friend.
My fist and his face made contact, should we say. Unfortunately, caused a bit of damage to his eye, and that was not the intention at all.
David was rushed to the hospital, where doctors feared he might lose the sight in his left eye. It took 3 operations to repair the damage. Though surgeons were able to prevent blindness, David's pupil remained permanently dilated. As a result, he appeared to have eyes that were different colours.
Later on, David said to me, I did him a favour. So, I mean, a lot of people think it's quite an interesting thing to have 2 different coloured eyes.
The injury kept David out of school for 3 months. And during that time, his feelings of being an outsider became more intense.
I felt often, ever since I was a teenager, so adrift and so not part of everyone else, with so many dark secrets about my family in the cupboard, that it kind of made me feel very much on the outside of everything.
But rather than dwelling on his feelings of alienation, David threw himself even further into music. Though he loved rock and roll, he also enjoyed listening to show tunes performed by cabaret singer Anthony Newley.
When I was a teenager, I sincerely wanted to write musicals for the West End and for Broadway.
The music was David's greatest passion. He also loved clothes, and the more outrageous, the better.
I would be a mod walking around Bromley in my mod clothes, and he would be an arty type walking around in his art school type clothes with his art school chums.
We used to walk around Bromley, trying pulling as many birds as we could, thinking that we were God's gift, talking about being famous.
By 1962, a new group called the Beatles was creating waves in Britain, and 15-year-old David set out to make some noise of his own. That summer, the budding rocker began testing his talent in a series of bands. His first, the Conrads, covered pop tunes and lasted about a year. He and friend George Underwood next formed an R&B group, the King Bees. With David now calling himself Davy Jones, the band even cut a single. It went nowhere. When the King Bees broke up soon after, George Underwood set his sights on becoming a graphic artist. But David was devastated by the split.
He said, it's all right for you, you've got your art. For me, this is my life. I know what he meant. It's like sort of, he'd committed himself and he's got to go, there's no turning back.
With the Beatles' invasion of America and the growing popularity of Britain's newest sensation, the Rolling Stones, David was even more determined to find fame as a musician. His next band was the Manish Boys, and he had a plan to make sure people heard more from the group than just their music.
The rebellion of the long hairs is getting underway. A 17-year-old, Davy Jones, has just founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men.
Well, I think we're all fairly tolerant, but for the last 2 years we've had comments like darling and can I carry a handbag thrown at us. And I think it's just had to stop now.
The media hype helped the Manish Boys land several respectable gigs, but eventually they too broke up. In 1965, still calling himself Davy Jones, the singer joined his fourth rock band, the Lower Third. But at the time, there was another Davy Jones on the music scene. In order to avoid confusion with the future Monkees member, David looked to American history in his search for a new, sharper-edged surname.
He saw this character, Jim Bowie, with the Bowie knife, and that name stuck in his head.
In September of 1965, at the age of 18, David Bowie was born. But it would be years before the singer would find the fame he craved. The kind of fame that young men from Bromley could never, ever dream of. By 1966, the London scene was in full swing. From the fashions of Carnaby Street and the world's first supermodel Twiggy, the music of The Who and the Yardbirds, a new youth culture had transformed the city's once buttoned-down lifestyle. That same year, David Bowie released his first solo single, Do Anything You Say. Though the song, which Bowie also wrote, failed to register on the charts, it did help him get a manager. The 19-year-old was signed by Ken Pitt, who'd once been the British representative for such stars as Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, and Duke Ellington.
Ken was a lot older than us, and he must have been at least 20 years older, and a showbiz kind of icon in the sense of theater.
One of Pitt's first suggestions was for Bowie to put together a cabaret act featuring nightclub standards and show tunes. David at first liked the idea and began rehearsing, but he soon decided he wanted to do more than sing other people's material and went back to writing and recording his own music. But David's career frustrations paled in comparison to a devastating development in his personal life. His 29-year-old half-brother Terry began exhibiting signs of schizophrenia.
David told me he was prone to fits of violence, outbursts of violence, but his emotions were being controlled by drugs at the time.
Terry's mental state worsened. It wasn't long afterwards that he was committed to an institution, and David began to worry that the illness might eventually afflict him as well. In September of 1966, David's manager lined up a contract for him with Derham Records. In light of Terry's situation, the good news was bittersweet. But David was reassured about his career, and his parents, especially his father, were delighted.
David's father was very supportive. He did encourage him a lot with his music.
Unfortunately, David's debut album entitled David Bowie sold poorly. The singer was discouraged, but his manager had more plans for him. Ken Pitt convinced his client to pursue acting in addition to music. And in 1967, David was cast as a drawing that comes to life in the short film The Image. David discovered he loved acting, and that fall he began studying with performance artist Lindsay Kemp, who had been taught by famed mime Marcel Marceau.
Lindsay probably was the biggest single influence on David. Lindsay taught him so much about the stage, about projection, about makeup, about clothing.
While working with Kemp, Bowie met Hermione Farthingale, a refined young woman from a middle-class family. David instantly fell for the doe-eyed dancer, and it wasn't long before the two were living together. In the summer of 1968, David teamed up with Hermione and friend John Hutchinson to form a group called Feathers. The trio used a mixture of music, dance, and poetry in their performances at venues around London. The following year, Ken Pitt financed a short promotional film to showcase Bowie's singing and acting talents. Love You Till Tuesday was built around several of David's songs. But David was devastated when Hermione broke up with him during production, explaining that she felt overwhelmed by the intensity of their year-long relationship.
He was pretty upset that his girlfriend had just left. Broken-hearted, actually, bless his heart. She was obviously very important to him.
David tried to dull his pain by focusing on a new venture. In 1969, he helped organize the Beckenham Arts Lab. The performance workshop was run out of the back of a local bar and gave various artists a chance to showcase their material. David also continued to develop his own ideas. A few months earlier, he'd seen the futuristic adventure 2001, A Space Odyssey, and had been inspired to write and record a song called Space Oddity. The tune was the tale of an astronaut named Major Tom, who is lost in space. The single was released in July of 1969, just days before the first manned moon landing.
Ground control to Major Tom. 7, 6. Commencing countdown, engines on. 3, 2. Check ignition and may God's love be with you.
Space Oddity was heard repeatedly in Britain during the week Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and David was ecstatic.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
But the song quickly slid down the charts. In the US, the record received almost no airplay. The fleeting taste of success both tantalized and frustrated David. Luckily, a new woman in his life helped distract him from his disappointment. Angie Barnett was an eager, aspiring singer who set out to play a role in shaping her new boyfriend's career.
She was a very foot-forward American girl who was larger than life in her approach.
As members of the counterculture movement of the late 1960s, David and Angie rejected the traditional rules of romance. Though they were a committed couple, they were free to date others if they wanted. Soon after meeting, David and Angie traveled to Malta for an international music competition. David's song, When I Live My Dream, from his debut album, had been entered in the contest and was singled out as Best Produced Record.
It was the first award he'd ever won. And he took it home to his dad so he could sort of legitimize, look, Dad, I won this award. I'm not just a sole long-haired wanker.
But within days of David's receiving his first professional recognition as an artist, his father, Hayward Jones, died of pneumonia following a sudden illness.
David took it like a man. He went and arranged all the funeral arrangements, and he took the responsibility from his mother, and it's quite amazing the way he handled it. If he had any emotional response, he was careful not to show it.
In September 1969, as David was coping with the loss of his father, Space Oddity renewed momentum and climbed the British charts, reaching number 5.
Planet Earth is blue, and there's nothing I can do.
Almost immediately, David tried to build on the success of the song by releasing a second album. As before, sales were disappointing. Like Major Tom, David Bowie's rock and roll dreams seemed to be drifting away. But by taking a controversial approach to performing, the singer's career would soon be launched into a whole new orbit. David Bowie's first hit single, Space Oddity, was considered by many to be a novelty song. Even so, the 22-year-old performer held on to his dreams of fame and set out to live the life of a rock star. In the fall of 1969, David and his girlfriend Angie rented a 30-room mansion in London and invited several friends to live with them.
We were about 7 people. We were like college kids. We had parties, and all kinds of strange people came in. It was really nice. It was like a hubbub of creativity.
In 1970, as Bowie planned his next move, the rock world was stunned by the breakup of the Beatles. followed closely by the drug-related deaths of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. By now, drug use was common among musicians and fans alike. David himself experimented, as did singer Lou Reed, who pulled no punches in writing songs about the trend. Bowie admired Reed's music, which pushed the boundaries of rock and roll by exploring themes of unconventional sex, cross-dressing, and social unrest.
Lou Reed was very important for all of us that thought we were very hip in those days, that's for sure. Because Lou was out of the box.
Lou Reed and his group, the Velvet Underground, were part of Andy Warhol's artists consortium, The Factory. David was intrigued by Warhol's revolutionary approach to creating art. But the singer's fascination with American avant-garde artists didn't stop there. He was also a fan of a raucous, over-the-top rocker named Iggy Pop.
Nobody ever said they liked Iggy and the Stooges. You just didn't admit to that in 1970 unless you were cross-dressing or on some sort of drugs or had just dropped out of life or high school, really.
David was drawn to Iggy's wild nature. And in time, Bowie would incorporate aspects of the American avant-garde into his own work.
David is a master of embracing a number of disparate elements and then fusing them into something totally unique.
In the spring of 1970, David formed a new group with the tongue-in-cheek name, The Hype. The band included Mick Ronson, John Cambridge, and Tony Visconti.
I went on the stage in a white leotard. I was Hype Man, and David was Rainbow Man, wearing like all these diaphanous scarves like hanging from his wrists and all that.
David found that performing as a fictional character gave him more freedom to express himself through music.
I was not a natural performer. I didn't feel at ease on stage. But I felt really comfortable going on stage as somebody else. And it seemed a rational decision to keep on doing that.
But audiences who saw The Hype didn't like the costumed band members.
They were yelling at us the whole time, calling us faggots and whatever, whatever filthy homophobic name you can think of.
David was upset by the crowd's response, but sexual slurs were not enough to make him retreat into more safe styles of performing. 1 month later, in his childhood home of Bromley, the maverick artist made a surprisingly conventional move when he married Angie. David's mother attended the ceremony, but the wedding didn't change the rules of David and Angie's open relationship. Following his marriage, the singer took a bold step in his professional life when he ended his 4-year affiliation with his manager, Ken Pitt.
This new thing, this kind of psychedelic rock thing, which was happening in the late 60s, Ken had no idea what this was about. And David, being a young man, saw the future flash before his eyes, and Ken Pitt didn't quite fit into that.
Bowie soon signed with the new manager. Lawyer Tony DeFries was in sync with David when it came to music and promotion.
He said, I'm gonna make you as big as a skyscraper. Tony DeFries would have painted sparrows yellow and sold them as canaries.
Angie also played a role in helping David break out from the growing crowd of aspiring rock stars. She suggested that her husband assume a more androgynous look, and soon David was wearing feminine clothing, even dresses.
I don't think he would have worn a dress without Angie's encouragement. She said that it's okay to do this. She's outrageous. She's a very outrageous woman, and David definitely needed a dose of outrageousness in his life at the time.
Bowie's new cross-dressing style quickly captured the attention of the press, who seemed to be more interested in David's sexual preferences than in his music.
You'd see it in the tabloids at the time. That was, Wowie, Bowie, and people were always yelling at him, are you a boy or a girl?
David appeared on the cover of his next album, The Man Who Sold the World, with long locks and wearing an elegant gown. One reporter commented that the singer looked more like Lauren Bacall than a rock and roll star. David laughed off the taunts and innuendos and surprised the public even further in May of 1971 when he and Angie welcomed a son, Zoe Bowie. David was thrilled to be a father, but there was little time to enjoy his new child. His career was finally gaining momentum. and within weeks, he was scheduled to travel to New York to sign a lucrative contract with RCA. David's first album with his new label was Hunky Dory, which included the hit single Changes. Not long after releasing the song, Bowie made an announcement that changed the way the world looked at him. In an interview in the trade paper Melody Maker, the flamboyant new star declared that he was gay.
That was incredibly brave, very brave.
There was some kind of British horror, shock horror outrage in the press, as there always is. But I remember thinking, oh yeah, good for you.
With the media attention, Hunky Dory record sales jumped, and David Bowie's career took a quantum leap.
The timing was impeccable, so it's debatable whether it was calculated or not, but he certainly used it. He used it, definitely. It brought more attention to the music, which was the desired effect.
The gender-bending mystique of David Bowie was now firmly established. The cross-dressing bisexual with a wife and child was the talk of the music industry. But David Bowie's next outrageous move would surprise even his growing legion of fans. He was about to transform himself yet again, and forever change the face of rock and roll. In 1972, Jesus Christ Superstar was rocking audiences on Broadway. Pioneer 10 was launched into space, carrying messages for potential extraterrestrial life forms. And a burglary in Washington, D.C. started a scandal that would force President Richard Nixon out of office. That same year, 25-year-old David Bowie took all the elements he'd learned about the performing arts and fused them together to create a daring, new stage persona, Ziggy Stardust.
Now Ziggy played guitar, jamming good with weird and spiders from Mars. When he played it left hand, but he made it too far, became the special man. Then we were Ziggy's band.
One of the inspirations for David's character was a 1950s American rock singer named Vince Taylor.
He was out of his gourd, totally flipped. I mean, the guy was not playing with a full deck.
Taylor was convinced that there was a connection between himself, UFOs, and Jesus Christ. During one performance, Taylor announced that he, in fact, was Jesus Christ.
And it was the end of Vince, his career, and everything else. And it was that and his story which really became one of the essential ingredients of Ziggy.
Ziggy's band, the Spiders from Mars, included Mick Ronson, Trevor Bolder, and Mick Woodmansey. The bold new act shocked conservatives, but there were tens of thousands of teenagers and young adults who were instantly drawn to Ziggy's otherworldliness.
People started to get interested because he looked so strange, different. Ziggy was essentially like a brilliant collage of a lot of different elements. There was a bit of Lindsay Kemp mime stuff, there was a little Warhol, there was some kabuki, and there was a whole lot of David Bowie.
Now Ziggy played guitar.
The rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars proved to be David's breakthrough album. It hit stores on June the 9th, 1972, and went gold soon after.
Ziggy came at the right time. You could feel the buzz in the air. It was like bigger than David, bigger than the band, bigger than the record company. It was almost like something that was meant to be in history.
One of the keys to Ziggy's success was Bowie's complete dedication to his extraterrestrial creation.
I believe in my part all the way down the line, right the way down. But I do play it for all it's worth. because that's the way I do my stage thing. That's part of what Bowie's supposed to be all about. I'm an actor.
Bowie's androgynous rock and roll spaceman helped launch the era of glam rock.
In the late 60s and early 70s, everything had become aesthetically quite pedestrian. And you had a lot of bands like Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, who I love, but they looked like farmers. And I think the glam rock people looked at it and said, you know what, let's be glamorous.
It wasn't so much what he was wearing, it was just the feeling he was putting across. You know, it was him, his actual self that was like that. And that's what was so strong.
David was the king, the queen, the prince, whatever you want to call him, of glam. He was its finest hour, its most potent force.
The outrageous nature of Ziggy kept David in the news, and Bowie fed the frenzy with more than just his appearance. When photographer Mick Rock snapped a highly suggestive picture of David and guitarist Mick Ronson, Bowie recognized another chance for star-making publicity.
David said, let's buy a full page in Melody Maker. It was an important shot for David. It was like Pete Townsend smashing the guitar or Jimi Hendrix setting it on fire. And that set the cat among the pigeons very nicely.
Bowie was bigger than ever, and his manager, Tony DeFries, set out to capitalize on David's new fame. In the summer of 1972, DeFries launched Main Man, a management company with Bowie as his star client. David was also becoming known for the songs he wrote and produced for others. His song, All the Young Dudes, was a hit for Mott the Hoople, and the Lou Reed chart-topper Walk on the Wild Side was co-produced by David. In September of 1972, Ziggy Stardust descended on America. Although David wasn't yet a big success in the United States, Tony DeFries felt that if you spent like a star, people would believe you were a star. As a result, more money was going out than was coming in during the American tour.
Everyone was staying at the Plaza, the Beverly Hills Hotel, room service 24 hours a day, roadies getting their underpants laundered, and lunatics were running wild, and no one was saying no.
The hype was maintained, and the bills were being paid with unearned advances that Tony DeFries secured from RCA Records.
I think that was Tony DeFries' genius. He got these guys to okay and cough up all kinds of money for an act that was not making them much money at that point in time.
As the American tour progressed, David began to be put off by his wife Angie's ongoing efforts to direct his career, and their relationship became strained.
She would help organize things, but once the show got to America, it all started to go to another level in terms of the development of what was going on, and I don't know that she ever learned how to handle it that well.
Ziggy's journey across the United States was a critical success, but unchecked spending made the tour a financial disaster. Even so, when Bowie returned to England, he was treated like a conquering hero.
I want to see him. They said he was coming around the back. I've been waiting for ages to see him.
What David's fans didn't know was that their idol had less money in his pockets than they did. But that didn't keep David from indulging in recreational drug use. And David's narcotic of choice was cocaine.
Right at the beginning, there wasn't much of that going on. After America, there started to be a lot more.
As David's cocaine habit escalated, the resulting weight loss combined with mental stress gave rise to the title of his next album, A Lad Insane.
The Lad Insane was, well, you know, I think it was a reflection of what he was going through. It was starting to work on his head, and, you know, some lad, London lad, going off his rocker very slowly, but having an interesting time doing it.
To promote A Lad Insane, Bowie headed off on a 100-day world tour. The first performances were at Radio City Music Hall. During one show, David collapsed on stage.
It was the ultimate in drama because the encore number was Rock and Roll Suicide, and after the song ended, he fell on the floor. He had definitely went unconscious for a while, and then of course the doctors and nurses came and he was fine, but it was scary.
In spite of the incident, David continued his grueling schedule. After completing the US leg of the tour, the band headed to Japan, then on to Russia, and back to England.
like a shopping city. Sounds sight. Sit alright, yeah.
When Bowie returned home, he learned that Aladdin Sane was #1 on the charts. The news should have made him happy, but it didn't. In the midst of all the Ziggy Stardust hype, David Bowie felt he had lost his way.
Still don't know what I was waiting for. Time was running wild. A million dead-end streets. Every time I thought I'd got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet.
All the feedback was coming to Ziggy Stardust. I mean, not to David Jones from Brixton. So he had created this alter ego, and the alter ego took over his entire life.
David continued to play to sold-out houses throughout Great Britain, including London's Hammersmith Odeon on July the 3rd, 1973. But to the audience's surprise, at the end of the show, the 26-year-old rock star made a startling announcement.
Not only is it the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do. Thank you.
Less than a year and a half after creating Ziggy Stardust, the shock rocker was giving up the character that had brought him fame, and fans were left wondering if David Bowie was just another shooting star who'd burned out before his time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, we love you.
Ziggy Stardust did indeed rise and fall, just as predicted in the title of 26-year-old David Bowie's hit album.
It had become a burden to him, and the only way to deal with it was to shake it off completely.
Ziggy Stardust was gone, but certainly not forgotten. The character continued to influence new musicians and was even an inspiration for a West End glam rock musical. The Rocky Horror Show opened in June of 1973 and was later made into a cult classic feature film.
So, come up to the lab and see what's on the slab.
In July 1973, Bowie had 5 albums in the top 40, 3 of them in the top 15, which was unprecedented for a solo artist. The singer's self-imposed retirement didn't last long. That fall, while Gladys Knight and the Pips, Cher, and the Rolling Stones were topping the Billboard charts, David released Pin-Ups, a tribute to some of his favorite British pop stars from the 1960s. He also set out to create a rock musical based on George Orwell's 1984. 21 songs were written before David found out he couldn't secure rights to the book.
David will always start a project with this idea, and it will grow and it will evolve, and it'll always end up to be something bigger or maybe a little bit different.
David incorporated the 1984 concept into his next album, Diamond Dogs. The first single from the LP was Rebel Rebel. Bowie continued to act the rebel in his personal life. Although he was still married to Angie, David started a serious relationship with singer Ava Cherry, whom he'd met while touring.
She was just a young girl, a lot of eye candy, and you're on the road, and he was always promiscuous along with Angie. They had a lifestyle that suited certain things.
Initially, David's wife seemed fine with the arrangement. But when Bowie moved to New York and began living with Ava, Angie's feelings changed.
She was jealous, she was upset, and even though she was doing what she wanted to do, for her it wasn't a two-way street. It was like, I want to play around, but I want you to be faithful to me.
By now, Bowie's method of writing songs was as unconventional as his marriage. He'd begun using a device he called cut-ups, a technique inspired by writer William Burroughs.
He would basically cut out words from an article, from a newspaper, from a book, wherever.
I tried doing it with diaries and things. I've used this method only on a couple of actual songs. What I've used it for more than anything else is igniting anything that might be in my imagination.
It's not because you're short of ideas necessarily, it's because it puts you into territories that you wouldn't otherwise get into. You wouldn't be led there by your own taste.
David continued his efforts to break the rules when he began planning the tour for Diamond Dogs. He envisioned an elaborate staging that would combine music, mime, and dance. Bowie wanted performance artist Tony Basil to choreograph the show, and his manager, Tony DeFries, spared no expense in his efforts to woo her.
When I was taken to dinner, David wasn't there, but there were several people with us, and the money that was being thrown around was a lot of money.
Even more money was spent on the production itself. And when the tour debuted in Montreal in June of 1974, it was unlike anything audiences had ever seen.
He was just willing to do theater, rock and roll, dance, story, everything.
It was very expensive. I can't see how they could have made a penny. I just think money was just going and going and going.
What he was focusing on at that particular time was his creative flow. David is a hands-on person on a creative level. But when it came to the business, I'm not quite sure if David was really involved.
But Tony DeFries was all business when he found out how much money the show was losing. He cancelled the scheduled London dates. This action quickly got David's attention, and he met with his manager to find out exactly what was going on with his finances. David was shocked to learn that over the years, most of his earnings had been used to pay back the ongoing advances DeFries had been securing from RCA.
I do remember Tony saying, being in the room once when Tony gave some paperwork to a secretary and said, "Take it to David, don't worry, he'll sign anything."
I think it was a big slap in the face for him because, you know, you look back and you see the body of your work, and at some point you want to see how much money you've made from that body of work, and there was nothing there for him.
David believed that he and DeFries were partners in main man management and had expected to share in the company's profits. But DeFries informed David that he alone was the owner of the operation. Bowie was no more than another one of main man's growing number of clients.
David's, because his brain wasn't there. His brain was, you know, the big picture, the stardom, the moving the culture. But obviously the chickens came home to roost at a certain point.
At the age of 27, David Bowie was flat broke. The groundbreaking rock star had achieved worldwide success. But now, he would have to keep working and keep reinventing himself, just to survive. In 1974, David Bowie found himself in serious financial trouble. The rock star realized that developing an interest in the business side of his art was critical to his survival on the music scene. He quickly scaled back production on his extravagant Diamond Dogs tour. But although David was now cautious about how money was being spent on the concerts, his limited personal funds were still being depleted by his ever-growing cocaine habit.
His diet often at the time was, cocaine and milk, so it was sort of pure white experience.
There's a fly floating around in my milk, and there's a foreign body in it, you see, and he's getting a lot of milk. It's kind of how I feel.
The destructive effects of David's addiction kept him underweight and paranoid about the world around him.
Oh, we're not stopped. Is there anything behind us? But no.
Like Ziggy Stardust and Vince Taylor before him, David Bowie was falling apart.
He was playing with the whole idea of self-destructiveness and about what can happen to people when they take drugs, and he lived dangerously.
But even under the influence, David was still exploring the boundless range of his creativity. He started work on his next album, Young Americans, by revisiting a childhood passion, rhythm and blues.
The man studied American R&B, make no doubt about it.
Soul music and R&B music definitely had a big influence for him growing up in England. So this was just a natural process to become involved with, you know, musicians of color.
Bowie's backup singers included Robin Clark, his girlfriend Ava Cherry, and Luther Vandross.
That's cool. That's cool. The next one. Got to do it this way to get it.
David called his new music Plastic Soul.
Plastic Soul just purely comes out of his sense of humor. That poking fun at, hey, look at me, I can do it too. And I'm not black, I'm not a soul brother. But he managed to capture what it was he needed to capture.
She wants a young American.
David recorded most of the songs for Young Americans in a little over a week. The speed at which he worked was due in no small part to his cocaine use.
It was the 70s. People were using cocaine thinking that it wasn't a bad drug.
Right, okay, and last section.
Honestly, that was the word on the street. So we were all sucked into that. I was worried for his health. He was very, very thin. His face was as white as a sheet of paper. And he was scary looking. But damn it, he'd go in front of the microphone and he sang beautifully.
He wants a young American.
After completing the initial recording sessions for Young Americans, David collaborated with guitarist Carlos Alomar and friend John Lennon on a single for the album. Fame was especially personal for David. Through it, he expressed some of his frustrations about his finances and management.
It was actually written about his relationship with Tony DeFries.
It is the smoke screen that was created by DeFries. It's the illusion of fame.
Sort of like you think one thing is happening, but you turn around and your pockets are empty. You think you're a star, but then you find out that you can't pay your rent.
Fame became David Bowie's first #1 hit in America. But its success only further reminded him of his unhappiness with Tony DeFries. John Lennon was an old pro when it came to dealing with managers and agents, and counseled David on what he should do.
When John found out what was happening, he said, you need to take control of this.
David followed the former Beatles' advice and took legal action to terminate his contract with DeFries. David was able to get out of the deal by agreeing to grant DeFries a portion of the royalties from records made during the term of his contract with Main Man Management. Young Americans was David's biggest-selling album in the US to date and made him a bona fide star in the all-important American market. But the career high point was soon followed by another personal low. In 1975, the 28-year-old singer moved to Los Angeles, where his cocaine habit finally caused him to lose touch with reality.
Los Angeles was one of the worst periods, I think, in my life, I think. I got into a lot of emotional and spiritual trouble there.
He told the story of waking up one morning in Los Angeles in the gutter, some gutter, he didn't know which gutter, and thought, if I don't do something about this, I'll die.
In June of that year, David took a break from music when an acting opportunity came his way. Director Nicholas Roeg was casting the part of an extraterrestrial in his latest film. David's name was among those suggested for the leading role. Physically, David was perfect for The Man Who Fell to Earth, a film about a space alien trying to save his drought-stricken planet.
He just looked like a person from another planet. At that time, he had the kind of strawberry red hair with the blonde streak, and he's very, very thin, and the two different colored eyes.
Although Bowie had limited acting experience, Nicholas Roeg felt David could handle the complexities of the role. But the director was concerned about David's reputation as a drug user.
When Nick and I went to first meet him, he said that during the movie, he would not be doing any drugs, so fine with us.
It's a fantastic movie about power, space, time, and the visitor. David Bowie stars in the man who fell to earth.
The Man Who Fell to Earth was only a modest success at the box office, but David's thoughtful performance earned him critical praise. In 1976, David released his next album, Station to Station, and unveiled yet another performance guise, the elegant, thin white Duke. The character was a far cry from the androgynous Ziggy Stardust.
He was doing the clean, chiseled look. The outfits were made specifically to give him a long, lean look.
Station to Station was David's highest charting album since Diamond Dogs, and included the top single, Golden Years.
Golden years, go. Don't let me hear you say life's taking you nowhere.
Revenue from the LP and income from his top-selling greatest hits collection, Changes One Bowie, put David back on solid financial ground. He soon moved his wife and son into a spacious home near Montreux, Switzerland, where his earnings could be sheltered from taxes. But David and Angie did not live as husband and wife. A few months later, David set out on his own and took a small apartment in Berlin. There, he tried to kick his long-time drug habit.
There was a lot less doping going on. He was living over an auto parts store with no central heating, so everything becomes a little more basic, a little more homemade, of necessity.
David's creative drive was re-energized in the new, simpler environment. While in Berlin, he produced Iggy Pop's album, The Idiot.
He'd done some really creative work on The Idiot as a musician for me. Basically, it says Iggy Pop and his band. Most of his band is just David Bowie overdubbing himself.
In 1976, as the glam-influenced and drug-saturated world of disco was being embraced by the mainstream, David Bowie was struggling to stay clean and sober. He was also determined to remain true to his art and set out to create yet another unconventional style of music. While living in Berlin, David Bowie continued to experiment in his search for a completely original sound. The result was an album called Low.
It was a kind of experiment in seeing what kinds of emotions pop music could cope with. You know, could it deal with despair and hysteria and idiot glee as well as the things that pop had dealt with up until then.
But the avant-garde Low stumped record industry executives and David's fans alike.
Even if you didn't like it, it was kind of important that it was a step that was going to make a difference, you know.
It really was the album that found the soul in the machine, that found a way to make something haunting and human out of electronic music.
Low sold poorly, but rather than scrapping his experimental new style, David made 2 more LPs which were also intended to break the pop music mold, Lodger and Heroes. The title track from Heroes became a hit for David.
Though nothing will keep us together. We can beat them forever and ever. Oh, we can be heroes just for one day.
In addition to exploring new modes of music, David made time to indulge his lifelong love of painting.
David would just sit in his flat and smoke and paint and write a song.
I think he wanted to make sure he was continually doing something productive and creative. He was always thinking that way.
In December 1977, the now 30-year-old rock star surprised his fans when he appeared with Bing Crosby on a family Christmas special for CBS.
I'm Bing.
Oh, I'm pleased to meet you. You're the one that sings, right?
Well, right or wrong, I sing either way.
Oh, well, I sing too.
Oh, good.
In fact, I've got a 6-year-old son, and he really gets excited around the Christmas holiday thing.
We just thought, I can't believe it, you know. David Bowie with Bing Crosby. What a marriage.
Come, they told me, ba-rum-pa-pum-pum, a newborn king to see, ba-rum-pa-pum-pum.
Bing was made more contemporary by it, and at that point, David wanted to diminish his role in the whole kind of underground, renegade, you know, lifestyle.
Our finest gifts we bring, ba-rum-pa-pum-pum, rum-pa-pum-pum, rum-pa-pum-pum.
The Bing Crosby special overflowed with traditional family cheer. But, ironically, Bowie's own home life was miserable. His marriage to Angie had deteriorated to the breaking point.
A lot of things happened that were pretty unsavory as far as arguments and disagreements and, you know, just turmoil in their relationship. And David didn't want to expose his son to that.
David took Zoe to Berlin for Christmas, while Angie celebrated the holiday in the US with friends. When Angie returned to Switzerland on January the 2nd, she was dismayed to discover that her husband and son were still away. Angry and depressed, she attempted suicide. Bowie was alarmed and became concerned about his wife's mental health and her ability to care for their child.
At a point in a marriage, you have to take a stand. You're either going to go with it or you're going to say, this has got to stop. There was a time when everything had to stop for the sake of Zoe.
The open marriage was now closed. You know, he said, I've moved on.
David's marriage to Angie was formally dissolved in 1980. In the settlement, David won sole custody of Zoe, who now preferred to be called Joe.
He said, I'm going to bring up my son. And that's a bold move to do for somebody in entertainment.
He totally became both parents to Joey, and he was great.
The newly single father was determined to be a positive role model for his son. But there was one problem. Bowie had yet to completely overcome his substance abuse.
Let's be real about addiction. It doesn't just happen, oh, suddenly I'm just going to stop. Sometimes it happens in a gradual level. David did not want his son to see him in a certain condition. And I think that eventually made it so that he was able to back off and back off and back off. Because when you have things going right for you, you don't really need that kind of high.
In the fall of 1980, David moved to New York, where he made his Broadway debut in The Elephant Man. The versatile performer starred as John Merrick, a man afflicted with a grotesque, disfiguring disease.
The Elephant Man, that appealed to me because of I have a sort of eclectic thing about freaks and isolationists and alienated people. I kind of gather information on people like that.
Without the use of heavy makeup, David portrayed the deformed outcast by manipulating his voice and twisting his body into a misshapen stance every night. His earlier training as a mime helped him achieve the desired effect.
You are a famous actress.
I am not unknown.
You must display yourself for a living, then, like I did.
That is not myself, Mr. Merrick. That is an illusion. Oh, this. This is myself.
This is myself, too.
Audiences were captivated, and Broadway's toughest critics gave Bowie high marks for his work. During the run of The Elephant Man, Bowie released his 17th album. Scary Monsters and Super Creeps included the single Ashes to Ashes, with lyrics alluding to an earlier chapter of David's life.
Do you remember Agatha's Spin? It's such an early song. I've heard a rumor from ground control. Oh no, don't say it's true.
Bowie revived Major Tom for the song and described the lost spaceman's struggle with drug addiction. To promote the single, he created a video version of the story.
Ashes to ashes, funk to funky. We know Major Tom's a junkie, strung out in heaven's high, hitting an on-time road.
Ashes to Ashes is an incredible song because he was playing off his own myth. I think it's deeply personal, but it's also incredibly public because it's a way of exercising that ghost.
Visual interpretations of songs were nothing new, but the complex imagery of the Ashes to Ashes music film helped put Bowie at the vanguard of the rock video revolution.
I think David Bowie's influence on early music videos was probably the greatest influence of all. He wasn't frightened to do something that was surreal. He wasn't frightened to go back to French silent surrealist movies. He wasn't frightened to do anything.
On December the 8th, 1980, David was shattered to learn the news that John Lennon had been shot and killed by a deranged fan outside his New York City apartment building.
He loved John. They were great friends. And David was broken. It was like he lost his brother. The death of John devastated him.
The circumstances of Lennon's death sent shockwaves through the entertainment community. 3 weeks later, when his run in The Elephant Man ended, David left New York and returned to Switzerland, where he mourned the loss of his friend and former collaborator. In 1982, David threw himself back into acting when he starred as a rapidly aging vampire in The Hunger, opposite Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve. But before the film was released, David received the disturbing news that his beloved brother Terry, who was still institutionalized, had jumped from a window in an attempted suicide. Terry survived the fall, and David rushed to see him. Characteristically, David said little to friends about his brother's situation.
As far as mentioning his family, it wasn't something that he readily did, nor was it something that we brought ourselves into or brought up.
In 1983, Bowie starred in the World War II drama Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Playing the remorseful Major Selliers, David tapped into his heartbreaking experiences with his own brother.
David played a character called Jacques Selliers, and he was, well, described as a soldier. And he was haunted by the fact that he believed that he let his young brother down.
I'm pleased to see you. Really, Jack?
I wanted to come.
Don't apologise.
But I've wronged you badly.
Help me water these things.
Look, I need to talk with you.
Hey, remember this one? Flowers once, every 5 years. That's all.
I'll be back before it flowers again.
Although Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence received mixed reviews, David's performance was singled out as one of the highlights of the film. After successfully carving out a name for himself as an actor, David felt ready to again focus on his music. But this time, he would push his own boundaries and shock both critics and fans alike. David Bowie was about to embrace the mainstream. By 1983, the music video was all the rage in the recording industry. That year, 36-year-old David Bowie signed a 5-year contract with EMI Records and made several videos to showcase his songs.
Put on your red shoes and dance the blues. Dance to the song they're playing on the radio.
Let's Dance went into heavy rotation on MTV, the new cable outlet designed to showcase music videos. The single was an overnight sensation and rocketed to the top of the charts.
Sway through the crowd to an empty space.
Video killed certain radio stars, but Bowie was one of this rock stars from an earlier generation who was perfect for MTV. He just has that majestic presence that made him a star for a new generation.
The Let's Dance album went platinum just 8 weeks after its release. In addition to the title song, the LP produced 2 other top 20 hits, China Girl and Modern Love.
What was cool about those days is that you could put on a record by David Bowie and it was accepted as a dance record. It was accepted as a song that could make people move.
David's fan base exploded. The esoteric artist, who had always been light years ahead of his time, was now right in sync with popular culture. People who had never before listened to David Bowie bought Let's Dance by the millions.
The Let's Dance period was very, very accessible. And it was accessible even to people like me, who were kind of getting on in life at that point. It was very much more popular and wide appeal than he normally appealed to.
David's latest musical experiment made him a household name. The tour to promote his new album was seen by more than 2.5 million fans. One of his concerts was at Hammersmith Odeon, where Bowie had put Ziggy Stardust to rest 10 years earlier.
The rock singer David Bowie is performing tonight entirely for the benefit of Brixton.
The charity show benefited the multiracial Brixton Neighborhood Community Association, which served the area where he had been born.
The conditions there were never that great, I mean, but it's definitely gotten a lot worse over the years. And it just looks as though it's been left there and forgotten, and that's really sad.
The working-class boy from Brixton now had the fame and fortune he'd always dreamed of, and he seemed to be enjoying every minute of it. He had homes in 4 countries and projected a polished, high-fashion image. By 1984, David found himself topping the charts in the company of pop stars like Tina Turner, Phil Collins, and Michael Jackson. Bowie's move to the mainstream even included an announcement that he was exclusively heterosexual.
It's a testament to Bowie that people found it strange that he slept with women. I remember saying, why do we care so much? I mean, ultimately, who he sleeps with is less interesting than who he makes music with.
But David Bowie's new middle-of-the-road image changed his direction in more ways than one. For the first time in his career, the musician began writing songs that weren't necessarily from his heart.
It seemed obvious that the way that you make money is give people what they want, and so I started giving people what they wanted.
In the fall of 1984, David released Tonight. Though sales of the album were strong, music critics felt the record was creatively bankrupt. But bad reviews would soon become the least of Bowie's concerns. In January of 1985, David received the shocking news that his brother Terry had committed suicide. David was overwhelmed with grief.
When he died and the whole thing happened, I think that David withdrew, and he didn't really share that with anyone, nor I don't think he wanted to. So it was a very difficult period, knowing that as friends we wanted to reach out, but we didn't want to bring up a subject that might cause him undue distress.
The loss of his brother was heartbreaking for David. But later that year, he put his own problems aside in order to bring attention to the plight of people starving in Africa. He was one of dozens of rock stars who performed at the Live Aid concert at London's Wembley Stadium. An audience of 1.5 billion around the world watched the event on live television or heard it on radio. David and his friend Mick Jagger also premiered a new video on the show. Dancing in the Street soared to #1, with all the profits going to benefit Live Aid. David continued to target mainstream audiences when he returned to acting in 1986. He starred in the movie musical Absolute Beginners, and later he played Jareth, the Goblin King, in Jim Henson's fantasy adventure Labyrinth. Although David wrote music for each of the films and scored a hit with the title song for Absolute Beginners, both movies failed at the box office. In 1987, David released Never Let Me Down, which he promoted on the flashy Glass Spider tour. But the show's production numbers, costume changes, and special effects left most audiences cold.
It was just a sort of David Bowie does Vegas version of himself. It was such a spectacle that it was completely boring.
I was like totally like, what the hell? This is so un-rock and roll.
David Bowie's brief love affair with the mainstream was coming to an end.
It just dried me up as an artist completely, because I wasn't used to doing that. What I'm used to doing is being very stubborn, obscure, confrontational in my own indulgent way, and enjoying every second of it.
In 3 short years, David Bowie's career had reached spectacular heights. Yet, in the process, he'd come dangerously close to tarnishing his sterling reputation as an avant-garde musical artist. But the prolific performer would soon take off in yet another new direction. And this time, David Bowie would find success on his own terms. In 1988, David Bowie surprised everyone when he formed a new act called Tin Machine.
Tin machine, the zombies never pass. The kind that beats his baby up, the preachers and their ass. Tin machine.
And it wasn't heavy metal. I think what it was rock and roll. It was just David Bowie once again reinventing rock and roll in a way that he could give a damn about.
Baby don't, clarity and prayer. There's more than money moving here, there's minds like a glare.
Tin Machine drew some fans, but most people didn't know what to make of David's group.
A lot of people tell you Tin Machine was a joke, it was nothing, but it really fulfilled its mission in allowing David Bowie to get re-interested in making music and in trying to communicate something with the music. That music was, I think, his response to what later would become alternative rock.
David found creative fulfillment with Tin Machine and was looking for the same kind of stability in his personal life. For 2 years, he dated American ballet dancer Melissa Hurley and even made plans to marry her. But ultimately, the 43-year-old singer and the 22-year-old dancer grew apart and split up. In 1990, David was introduced to international fashion model Iman at a small dinner party arranged by a mutual friend. Before the night was over, David has set his sights on a new romance.
He claims that he knew immediately I was the one. It took me maybe a week.
After 6 months together, the love-struck rock star proposed to his girlfriend over a candlelight dinner in Paris.
David courted me a very old-fashioned way, which was such a delight. People don't expect things like that from him. You know, they think he's so hip and happening, and but he's truly an old-fashioned gentleman.
In April of 1992, David and Iman were married. First in a civil ceremony, and again 6 weeks later at a lavish wedding in Florence, Italy. David's now 20-year-old son, Joe, served as his best man.
At his wedding, there was Brian Eno, Bono, and Yoko Ono. And I thought, there's a gag waiting to happen, Eno, Ono, and Bono. How often, do you get all 3 of those at one wedding?
David swept me off my feet, and I'm still off my feet. He has managed somehow, I don't know, miraculously, to have my heart flutter when he walks into the room still. So, yes, he's definitely the one. He's definitely my one.
In 1993, David's marriage to Iman inspired him to release his first solo project in 5 years. Black Tie, White Noise was a very personal album for David. It included Jump, They Say, a song he wrote about his brother Terry's suicide.
He has no eyes, they say. He has no mouth. They say, hey, that's really something. They feel he should get some time. I say he should watch his ass, my friend. Don't listen to the crowd. They say, jump.
It had been more than 7 years since Terry's death, and it had taken David nearly that long to come to terms with the tragedy.
One almost gets a sense that Terry is this ghostly figure in his whole career, this sort of the path that he was fortunate enough not to take. That always seems to be a part of his work, the fine line between madness and insanity. And his music has, walked that line at times. In 1994, David Bowie was making a name for himself in a new field, the world of fine arts. Painting had been a creative outlet for the musician since childhood.
David has a great passion for art. And in the fine arts, people, anything having to do with David, they get excited about.
David's accomplishments as an artist and art connoisseur were recognized when he was appointed to the editorial board of the highly regarded magazine Modern Painters. On the music front, David was invited by MTV to play on their concert series Unplugged. Unlike other rock stars who had done acoustic versions of their classic hits on the program, David wanted to perform only new material. This approach failed to fit the format of the show, and he chose not to appear.
I think that artists should stand up for what they believe in. He said some things to me that I call Bowieisms that I keep to this very day. And he would say things to me like, Niall, if you come from art, you'll always be art.
Bowie's choice to put artistry first was also evident in his next project. Outside was a concept album about art and murder.
When David makes a song, he doesn't just make a song, he makes a character as well. All his songs, to me, are like little plays, And he's the playwright, and he's also the actor, in the things. And this was something he tried a lot on Outside.
When it came time to tour with the album, Bowie invited Trent Reznor and his industrial rock band, 9 Inch Nails, to join him.
He said he's just finished a new album that he doesn't expect it to sell well, and if we tour together, he expects his band will probably get blown off the stage because of what he's trying to do, but that's not, it doesn't matter, it's about, I have to do this.
It's a kind of living.
That fearlessness is really, it's inspiring to be around, and I think there needs to be a lot more of that in music today.
There is no hell.
Reactions to the Outside tour were mixed. The LP itself received some critical praise, but as David had feared, it was not a commercial success. Bowie took another chance with his next album, Earthling, and scored a top 20 hit in Britain with the single Little Wonder.
Stinky weather, fat shaking hand, dopey morning dog grumping us. Little wonder then, little wonder, you little wonder you.
In 1996, Bowie's wide-ranging musical achievements were officially recognized when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
He understands that he has a huge legacy and that he has left a big imprint on modern culture. He was not someone to look back very much. I think it's hard for him in a way nowadays because people want him to look back all the time. And David still, he's concerned about his latest record.
After nearly 4 decades of personal struggles and hard work, David Bowie now enjoyed a level of peace and satisfaction he had never known before. But despite his groundbreaking accomplishments, the multifaceted artist had no intention of slowing down. At the age of 53, David Bowie became a father again, when he and his wife Iman celebrated the birth of a daughter, Alexandria. David was overjoyed, and this time, without career obligations to keep him away from home, Alexandria quickly became the center of his life.
She's totally spoiled by him. You know, of course, he was over the moon that her first word was Dada, and I kept on telling him, no, that's the easy word. No, he's not buying it.
At one point, I asked him, I said, how are you, how's it going? And he says, oh, I'm a stay-at-home dad,
David owed the stability he now had in his personal life to years of being clean and sober. And all the while, David's relationship with his son, Joe, had remained close.
My relationships with my friends, my family, everybody around me are so good and have been for so many years now. I wouldn't do anything to destroy that again.
In 2002, David released Heathen under a new contract with Columbia Records. The initial single from Bowie's 35th album was Slow Burn.
These are the darkest of all. Like a slow burn leading us on and on and on.
In the fall, David also released The Best of Bowie, a collection of his most popular songs and performances. That same year, the 55-year-old rock visionary continued to energize the music scene when he headlined the Area 2 tour. He was joined on the road by hip-hop artist Busta Rhymes and one of Bowie's avant-garde musical heirs, Moby.
The new music that he's making, it's really remarkable. It's just as good as music that he was making 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
1 month later, the 30th anniversary of Ziggy Stardust was celebrated with a digitally remastered version of Bowie's breakthrough album, along with a theatrical re-release of D.A. Pennebaker's concert film of Ziggy's last performance.
You can still put on Ziggy Stardust, and it could have come out last month, and it still sounds, somehow, it sounds pertinent, timely, effective.
Over the years, bands such as Talking Heads, R.E.M., and U2 have cited David Bowie's body of work as a major influence on their music. Newer generations of musicians also continue to look to David for inspiration.
He really did pave the way for a lot of things that are going on today, as far as, stylistically and musically, and also in his capacity to experiment so successfully.
His perseverance to be original all the time, he's like a chameleon. He always wants to change with the times.
David Bowie's desire to keep changing is the one thing that has remained constant about his career.
A lot of what I do is, in fact, very simple. It's just that my choices are very different to other people.
From the beginning, David Bowie's unique vision has set him apart from his peers. It is the key to his enduring popularity as a contemporary artist who has spanned the 20th and 21st centuries.
Still don't know what I was waiting for, and my time was running wild, a million dead-end streets, and every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet.
He has become an icon of innovation, one that has forever changed the world of popular music.
He did more than reinvent the rules. He set the stage for a world in which there were no rules.
What David did was something that moved the culture.
David Bowie is constantly analyzing things.
Curiosity, I think, is the most single thing that propels him forward.
David had a sense of fearlessness, cultural fearlessness.
He's someone who's had an ability to dictate trends as opposed to follow them.
Time may change me, but I can't trace time.
David taught younger musicians how to be free.
He has, against all odds, become a very, very respected artist. Now, to continue to create great stuff, when most people would just rest on their laurels, he's right out there. He's right at the forefront of creativity, and he's cool.
I said that time may change me, but I can't trace it.
David Bowie is cool.